I wanted to do a few videos about some of the stories in the Bible which seem to be incredibly awkward. I haven't done a video for a little while, so I'm going to just pick out some Bible characters and out of this just illustrate some of the things that the Bible teaches us, but sometimes it's through some very unusual lessons. So the first one I want to just cover is Matthew chapter 1. And we're given the genealogy of Jesus. So it starts out at the beginning of Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew, explaining who Jesus is. And it says this in verse 3, Judah, the father of Perez and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar. Now, Tamar is a lady. It's unusual perhaps to be talking and unpacking about some of the women in the genealogy. It's something that Jewish tradition wouldn't be so bothered about, really. What mattered for them very much was the male line of heirs. But Tamar is not particularly a positive mention, surely, because Tamar was somebody who got involved in a very, very awkward and sticky situation. And we read about that in Genesis 38. And what happens is Judah, one of the brothers who the son of Jacob, he gets involved in Tamar, and what happens is you end up with a situation where this girl pretends to be a prostitute and ends up being used really by Judah. A terribly messy situation, not great at all, and a lot of brokenness and damage in the whole situation, it seems. And then it says in verse 27, when the time came for her to give birth, there were twin boys in her womb. As she was giving birth, one of them put out his hand, so the midwife took a scarlet thread and tied it on his wrist and said, this one came out first. But when he drew back his hand, his brother came out, and she said, so this is how you have broken out. His name was Perez. Then his brother, who had the scarlet thread on his wrist, came out, and he was given the name Zerah. So we see that these two, they appear also in Matthew chapter 1, verse 3. Judah, the father of Perez, and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar. So in a very broken, dysfunctional situation where things have got very complicated and messy, and she's been used in a very unhealthy and unholy circumstance, really. These two children are the outcome of that situation, and yet what we notice in the story is something very remarkable. The scarlet thread that is put around the hand of one of the children. And the scarlet thread has a particular theme to it. And we see that theme also in the story of Rahab, which we also mentioned. But there's something very special about the scarlet thread. And it reminds us about the story of the redemptive thread that goes through the history of the Bible, and in this case, very literally, a scarlet thread, and we see that that thread of God's redemptive purpose being played out in the middle of this genealogy, in the middle of the story of Jesus and how Jesus comes to be, despite brokenness, despite mess, despite tragedy, despite dysfunctional relationships. Even in the midst of all that, God still pursues his redemptive purpose. And what we find incredible, really, is there is Tamar, the daughter-in-law of Judah, and someone who then becomes pregnant through the father-in-law, through his assumption that actually she was just a wayside prostitute. And yet, in the middle of all that muddle, God brings still his redemptive purpose to redeem what was a mess and bring something incredible into the history and genealogy of Jesus. And that's why Matthew mentions it. He mentions that story to remind us that the Old Testament is full of these incredibly awkward stories, these incredibly awkward scenarios, the brokenness of people's humanity, the mess that their lives can be. But nevertheless, even despite that, that God can still be at work. And so God is not saying this was a great situation by any means, but even despite these things, God can still work. Somehow he weaves his thread of redemption through the story of the Bible and through the messy stories, through the difficult circumstances, through the incredibly awkward stories, not just the easy ones. That is the God who brings redemption and brings redemption into the human experience. And I just want to pray today that whatever mess that we might feel has happened in our lives, maybe the outcomes of that have been very difficult, maybe the way in which things have happened, even in relationships, has been very difficult. I pray that in the middle of all that, God would bring a redeeming story, a redemption story, even out of the worst of scenarios. And so he will show himself to be the God of redemption for you today.